record my computer. All right, and we're good to go. So welcome, Trisha and Erin. This would have been an Instagram Live for a Wellness Wednesday interview with both of you, but logistically speaking, we were not able to do that. So we're switching off to do a live discussion for all three of us to be on at the same time. So I'm going to start with just asking you to introduce yourselves, but I also, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Dina. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist in New York City. I run a very part-time private practice and a virtual online platform that's called Dish with Dina. And I do a lot of stuff on social media, this being one of those things where I like to introduce and talk to people about certain topics. So in our cases here, we are focusing specifically, this is being recorded now in February. And so the week that this will be out there and airing is National Eating Disorders Awareness Week in the States. And I believe maybe even, well, it's National Eating Disorder, so it would be the States, but I'm sure that there are other things across the world as well that recognize this. So Trisha, would you like to introduce yourself? And then I'll go to Erin. And if there's anything else, of course, that you want to, share in your introduction.
Hi, I'm Trisha, and I think one of the things that makes me me is that I've lived across different cultures. I was born in Singapore, then I spent much of my adolescence in China, and then now I'm here in the United States. And I went to an international school in China, and that gave me sort of an odd perspective because when I stepped into school, that was a totally different world, and that had different expectations of me than when I was at home. And I think that definitely impacted my relationship with food and how I saw myself. So I'm really excited to talk about that today. And Erin will introduce herself, but we've been friends for a long time, and we were in touch throughout a lot of our struggles together in the realm of like disordered eating and eating disorders. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with Dina and Erin.
Thank you. Yes, Erin, go ahead. Now on to you.
Okay, awesome. So hi, I'm Erin. I'm 22 actually. I just turned 22. And I go to school at Occidental College. But like Trisha, I used to go to an international school in Shanghai, specifically SAS. So yeah, I think both me and Trisha have similar backgrounds in that we both went to international school, yet like the way we were raised in our family, like the culture is completely different. So the fact that we were exposed to both American and Chinese culture, I think really shaped the way we are as people, but also like the way we relate to food as well, and also our bodies. And on the side, I run like a little food account. I try to be and spread a lot of body positively messages, specifically regarding the Asian community, because there is a significant lack of representation and diversity in that area. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you guys and share more about my experiences.
Me too. And so just to give everybody an idea of what's going on in the world, so Trisha and I are both on the East Coast, New York City, and Erin is calling in live from Shanghai, correct? So we have quite
that is correct.
Yeah, quite the international thing going on here. So Trisha, do you mind sharing just a little bit too before we even start? Because we had talked a little bit before our conversation here. My family is from Italy. My mom and dad were born in Italy. I was born here in America, so I'm first generation. And so I'm interested to see how all of our lives might be somewhat similar or different, or some comparisons there. But before we launch into something as sensitive a discussion as eating disorders are, I know you mentioned you might want to just do a little disclaimer first, just to share about our experiences and what the viewers might be able to keep in mind.
Yes, so Erin and I have both struggled with different eating disorders in the past, and that comes with a unique set of challenges while also growing up across different cultures. But we want to talk specifically about what it's like to grow up in an Asian household while struggling with an eating disorder and having a Western perspective on that. And we want to be candid in how that impacted either the treatment we did get or didn't get. but we understand that, first of all, this isn't everyone's experience, and also we're not trying to bash the Asian culture. This is just what we've been through.
Yeah. So Erin, I'm not sure how much you know about me, but I'm an adjunct lecturer at one of the colleges here, and one of the classes that I teach is called Food Society and Health, and we go globally around the whole world, you know, and look at people's foodways and cultures, and it really is so different whether you're growing up in Africa or down in the Caribbean or in China as to how people consider your body image and the way that you are eating or not eating correctly in that way. And we also sometimes, you know, share stories of when I was, not me myself, but when one of my students was pregnant, if, you know, somebody had some comments to make that you're eating too much or too little for your child. It's just so weird at how some people, I guess, don't necessarily understand the backgrounds of people's cultures, and how our experiences growing up could positively or negatively affect our formative years and as an adult as well. So whoever wants to go first, if you want to share a little bit about your current, you know, your history of where things maybe took place for you and when you started recognizing some of the issues you were having. So however you want to do this, Trisha, Erin, who wants to go first?
I think I can go, and then we can go to Trisha. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I would definitely say this is actually really funny because I've been thinking about it today, and the first really big sign that I realized I kind of had like a little bit of a disordered eating or eating disorder problem. I actually told Trisha about it, which is really funny and ironic. But I remember distinctly it was 7th grade. I downloaded MyFitnessPal on my phone, that wretched app. Never again. But yeah, it was 7th grade. I wanted to like really lose weight because I was on a swim team, and my mom basically made a lot of comments as to like my shoulders were too broad. I was like really bulky, and I started swimming a lot slower than other people because I was gaining weight. Just like adolescence, you know, like your body is changing. So a lot of my motive when I first downloaded MyFitnessPal was to lose weight, and oh my gosh, I cannot begin to describe the rabbit hole I really went down, because as I started tracking my calories and like weighing myself every day, it just got excessively really, really bad. To the point where I was like being very competitive with myself. And I would try to like eat as less as I could every single day. And then I got to a point where I got just really fed up with it. I was like, I'm so done. This is like really boring and like wasting so much of my time. And then I remember I started eating a lot, and like a lot. And I told Trisha, I was like, I think I have like binge eating disorder or something, because I just like could not stop eating. And as that happened, I was gaining weight, of course, like the overshoot weight. And as I was going through that, I ended up deleting my fitness pal. I was like, no more, I can't take this anymore. So after that experience, I think that was like definitely my first time I really had a very toxic relationship with food and my body. And then it got a lot worse when I went to college. And because I was moving across the country, I was going to an environment I was very, very not used to. I wasn't sure what the food was going to be like. I wasn't sure like what I was going to get like at school, like what kind of food I'm going to be eating, because it would be very different from what I had at home. And the first thing on my mind when I went into college was I want to avoid the freshman 15. And that was a very, very, very big goal of mine. And so during my first year of college, I was very like hyper focused on food, especially since, as I said, like I wasn't familiar with the food I was eating, even though it's like stuff like salads, pasta, like tacos. Like I don't eat that like in China here, like at all. So it's like very new to me, and so I got really obsessive with making sure I ate really healthy and making sure I went to the gym just like every single day. And then that kind of spiraled into my summer after freshman year. I ended up staying on campus for a summer internship. And because the internship was only part-time, I had a lot of time on my hands to do whatever I wanted. So I downloaded my fitness pal again. And I was like, okay, like let's go back to this. I'm gonna try this again. Like it should work. And at that point, like I really wanted to reach a certain goal weight. Um, I'm not sure if this will be triggering. I actually like but like just disclaimer, like just like for some numbers involved, I was like 63 kg my entire life, and then I got in my head like I really, really, really want to reach 60 kg because like according to BMI, I was overweight at 63, and obese. So I was like, okay, like let me challenge myself to like lose a little bit of weight. And then so once I downloaded my fitness pal again and I had so much time on my hands, I was just meticulously counting calories, counting how much I was exercising every single day. And it got to the point where I bought a food scale and I would measure my food to the exact gram so I could count in my fitness pal the exact number of calories I was eating. And then it got to the point where before I slept, I would think about what I would be eating the next day and I would plan it in my phone because I would know what the cafeteria offered the next day. So I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna get this, I'm gonna get this amount, like I'm gonna have this today, like it will reach my protein level, like I'm doing like a really, really hard session at the gym tomorrow, like maybe I'll eat more of this. So I would just like plan my meals ahead of time, at least a day in advance. And so my entire summer, I was so focused on food. Food became my life, basically. My life revolved around food and like going to the gym and trying to reach that goal. And that at that point, I realized I just like I didn't know how toxic it was until I ended up losing my period. And once that happened, I was like, shoot, like I really did something bad to my body. Um, and that was a little bit of a wake up call for me. I also got like a lot of other symptoms where when you would be like under eating, like such as like I would be just very, very cold all the time. Like a lot of my hair would be falling out as well. And then I also just had like no sexual drive, like zero interest in anything. So all those symptoms, like, but the one that really, really stuck to me was like me losing my period because I knew how important that was to my health and everything. So after that, I like went to a therapist and I also sought out like a dietitian as well, just because I was struggling so much with food and like my entire brain was just food, food, food. Like, what am I going to eat? Like, should I eat less today? Do I deserve to eat today? Like, will I exercise tomorrow? Like, if I don't exercise tomorrow, I don't want to eat that much. It's just like so very, very obsessive. And I ended up getting diagnosed with bulimia. So specifically like exercise bulimia. And that made me like, I think once that happened and alongside like when I lost my period, I think that was like a very, very big wake up call for me. And I decided after that that I need to get my period back. So I started like eating a lot. And during that time I gained so much weight and it made me so uncomfortable. But I knew that like I had to or else like my body was basically deteriorating. Um and as I was going through that and I ended up getting my period back like after 6 months, so that was good. But those thoughts in my head, like those obsessive thoughts about food, kept arising. And it also got really bad when I went to study abroad last semester in Panama. And when I came back home because of COVID in Shanghai, I started getting those obsessive thoughts around exercise again, just like constantly wanting to not allowing myself to eat if I didn't go to the gym. And that was my rule for myself. If I didn't go to the gym, I wasn't allowed to eat that much that day. And it took me so long to just really finally realize that I deserve food no matter what. And just being alive, you deserve to eat. There is not one day where you don't deserve to eat and deserve to nourish yourself. So I am very, very glad that I am at this mental state now, but it's been a very long journey. I would say I've definitely had those ups and downs for sure. But I think it takes time, it takes learning, it takes patience as well, just like forgiving yourself as well. So yeah, I mean, it's been a roller coaster. It's been multiple years of healing, but in the end, yeah, we are good.
Erin, first of all, thank you for sharing such a personal story. I mean, I'm getting very teared up because a lot of stuff that you're saying doesn't necessarily resonate specifically with me, but I definitely know as a female growing up just in America that there's so many stipulations as to what people think are ideal and perfect, and that striving towards those things. And so as I usually do, by the way, for people watching, I'm putting my head down because I'm scribbling things that I'm in no particular order. I just want to at least address, and then Trisha, I'll go to you to ask your side of things and how your experience maybe was different or similar. But first of all, that's a 10-year journey for you. Seventh grade is about 12 years old or so. So that's when that
Yeah.
was first starting for you. That's that seems incredibly young, but that is actually about 3 years older than the average year for females, where we start seeing patterns like that develop. So we're talking 9 or 10 years old. That's a very young age for you, Erin, at 12. It's
Mhm.
not like it makes it any better that that happened to you later in life, but the fact that it took you 10 years to really not necessarily even recover. I mean, because it sounds like you still do have some triggering issues that might happen, but at least you recognize them now, it sounds like, and that you also have some strategies put in place for that. And so one of the things I was writing down here too, for those of us in the health and wellness field, especially with people who are working with competitive sports, right? So team sports or whatever kind of athletic stuff you're doing, there's something called the female athletic triad. It's now called, oh gosh, I can't remember. They've termed it something else, REDS. I can't remember what it stands for. But in those group of symptoms, the three symptoms that include in the female athlete triad are amenorrhea, so that's the stopping of your menses cycle, right? So you don't get your period anymore. An actual eating disorder, either recognized or unrecognized, and osteoporosis too, because what's happening is your body is being depleted of body fat, like not just weight in general, like body composition, but body fat, and then also the wearing away of your bone mass and muscle mass. And body fat plays a huge role in hormonal production. So it makes sense that when you're getting that far down to an extreme weight loss where the body fat then also starts to be depleted, that no longer can your hormones be created properly. So I'm really glad that you ended up turning that around. I mean, again, it sounds like your journey was almost, in a compensatory way, like making up for lost time to get you back to what would be considered a quote unquote like normal weight for yourself. But the fact
Yeah.
that you did that to move towards that direction, and some of the other things too here, the fact that there are compensatory behaviors to pay attention to. So for anyone watching this, if you yourself are going through something like this, or you're watching somebody who is close to you, and you notice exactly what Erin said, like, I don't deserve to eat unless I burn it off in some way, or I track so specifically that I can't go 1 calorie over, or that there's this obsessive measuring things. And I'll talk a little bit too after Trisha's done explaining her side of her history of my concerns about the dietetics profession, of being a dietitian that is not necessarily qualified to work with people in that specialist type of way, of what I'm kind of concerned about. So for whoever's watching this, wherever you're coming from, whether you are part of the dietetics field or a student or someone working in healthcare in particular, I hope that a lot of this stuff gives you some, no pun intended, food for thought in that case. Okay, so Trisha, do you want to share a little bit too about your side of things? And also, I know you both want to also tell us about the actual history, or how perhaps being in an Asian culture, like what role that does play. And I'm happy to also share the Italian side of things just to compare and contrast. But I want to get your history first.
All right, I'll try to keep this a bit shorter so we can also have time for other things. But I think in my case, my family dynamic has definitely played a big role, because my dad came home every night, but he was often at work all day. So I spent a lot of time with my mom. And I don't know how she grew up, but she was very, very obsessed with how she looked. And I know that she went through a significant weight loss earlier on in her life that kind of made her think that this is the way I have to keep things. And in that same vein, I think she also tried to make sure that I stayed at a certain weight all my life. And growing up, when I would lose or gain weight, she would always make comments about that. And there was a point in 8th grade when she would tell me every single day that I had to lose weight, even though I was a normal weight. And that really got to me, I think. And around 9th grade, I started to really restrict what I ate, because at the time I was dealing with depression, and I felt like this was my last resort to trying to make myself happier. And that backfired, obviously. But in the beginning, especially, I was very much like just restriction, exercise, nothing else. And I remember my sleep schedule was really messed up because I was drinking so much tea to try to keep myself full and have energy. And when I didn't drink tea, I would just sleep 15 hours a day. And then when I was up for 3 hours, I would then blame myself for eating like 3 cashews. And that got really bad for a while, and I lost a lot of weight. And what was really hard for me was that I think, unlike a lot of people who struggle with eating disorders, I knew that I had a problem. I think I didn't want to acknowledge outwardly that I had a problem, but I kind of knew that no one was gonna vouch for me unless I do that for myself. So I did try to speak to people at school, or someone I saw about it, but I just felt like I was never taken seriously for whatever reason. I was underweight, so I don't know why, even though I was underweight, I wasn't taken seriously. And when you have an eating disorder, your eating disorder convinces you that you're making it all up and you're not actually dealing with anything, and your problems are all in your head and it's not a big deal. So I think being ignored by professionals just made that worse. And I actually just finished writing a blog post about that. It's ready to go up next week. And so that started in 9th grade, and then in 10th, 11th, 12th grade, up until the first few years of college, I started to purge. I would not really binge, I would just purge, because that felt like my way of not only getting rid of food, but also it felt like cleansing in a weird way, because I felt like I was purging all the negativity away, and I just felt so light afterwards, and I was addicted to feeling weightless, basically. And it you know it really significantly impacts how you can have functional relationships in your life. And I didn't have very many friends in high school because I didn't know how to talk to people, because I forgot what it was like to be a teenager and hold a conversation with people. So I would just kind of retract to my hole and keep staying in that cycle. And I tried to change my behaviors many, many times over the years, but I always failed because I didn't have support and I was not taken seriously. And when I did have a therapist, they would always want to talk about the depression side of things, but they wouldn't really want to talk about the eating part, and that never really got addressed. And so I would be trying to go on whatever calorie thing is out there and try to make a meal plan for myself. Like, I have to at least eat 1,200 calories today or else it's not good. But I would always fail because I would not stick to it, because part of recovering is to let go of that obsession, but I can't let go when I'm trying to make myself a meal plan. And so for me, recovery was very, very, very slow, much slower than it needed to be. And I hope that people watching this realize that it doesn't have to be that way, and that there's nothing wrong with asking for help. It just makes your life easier. It doesn't mean that you can't do it on your own. Like, you're doing the work. It's just, this is work you don't have to do.
Thank you, Trisha. I mean, this is very emotional for me just to even listen to all of both your stories, because I'm so sorry that you had to go through all of that, especially at such a young age. And what Trisha, you mentioned too, that I wrote down, relationships. So who you feel safe with, who's not taking you seriously too, that was an issue for me as well. And the people that you would normally maybe go to ask for help weren't necessarily on your side. So Erin, do you mind also addressing some of that too? Like, if you don't mind, if you want to share on this, the discussion about communicating with your parents or your family members, and then the discussion about also the healthcare professionals, or even just authority figures in your life, like maybe teachers, or anyone who you can go to consider an authority figure in that way, whether they were a healthcare provider or not. Tell us a little bit about your successes or challenges in that, because again, I also want to tie into the culture component here too, of what is expected for you.
Yeah, of course. So like Trisha, I definitely grew up around my mom making very, very common weight comments, just regarding, because I grew up very sports centered. I would play a lot of sports, and when I entered high school, I started playing rugby, and she would just basically say, don't do that because you're going to be too muscular, and girls aren't supposed to be muscular. They're supposed to be like fragile and like dainty and like skinny and white. Like the whitening is very, very big in China. Just like the fact that I was tan as well, she would make comments on my skin color, just be like, you're too dark. Yeah. I'm sure Trisha can relate. um but yeah, it's just like the fact that I grew up around sports a lot. Um, she would just like frown upon it because I would just like be gaining. My shoulders were too broad. Yet she signed me up for swim classes my entire life, and then I would go to tennis. She'd be like, "Your arms are getting too big," or like I go to ballet, and then she'll be like, "Your legs are getting too big." So it's like no matter like how my body was changing, even when I lost my period and I lost weight, she would be like, "Why are you still so fat?" That would also just be something she would say to me the first time she saw me after college. And it just really hurt because like you haven't seen your parents in like a semester. It's like 4 months, 3 months. And the first thing they say to you is, why have you gotten fat? And I'm like, is there anything else you can say to me? But yeah, it's just like those comments, this constant long like always I grew up around it, not only from my mom but also from my relatives. And I would definitely say like tradition plays a very big role in it because I used to ask my dad, I'm like, why does auntie and uncle always comment on my weight and like my face shape? And my dad's like, oh, it's just like talking about the weather in Western culture. It's just like conversation. It's like easy conversation. You just talk about how like someone got skinny or fat. Like it's conversation. But it gets to the point where like you start like as you are more exposed to it, you start really believing it. Like, oh, I am fat then. Like my face is too big. Like they keep saying my face is getting bigger every year. Like maybe it is. Um, and then like when you say that these comments are hurtful, they just like brush it off and be like, oh, they're just joking, it's fine. Like mom's just joking when she calls you fat, it's okay, like you don't have to take it so seriously. And it's like invalidating how I feel basically, and like how we feel. So it's very, very frustrating for sure. And when and along the lines of like professionals, when I lost my period, I went to a gynecologist just like check up, like make sure I was like okay. And I knew in the back of my head it was from dieting. And I told her, I was like, yeah, like I lost a bit of weight. Like I went from like 63 to 60. And she's like, oh, that's not a lot. That's not a lot of weight. And I was like, wait, but like that's not a lot of weight. Yet my body obviously says it is a lot if I've lost my period, which is a very big, very big health problem. So again, like invalidating my experience, invalidating my feelings. So those comments just it's really tough just growing up around them constantly around you. Just being bombarded not only by your immediate family but also your distant family, your relatives. Also just social media, which I think we can get into a bit later on, but it is a very big part in Asian culture, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And Trisha, what about you on your side there too? Because I know you're now working with me in some respects too. So you're seeing a lot of different sides of the dietetics field and the profession, and that especially in the more modern generation of dietitians, we are approaching the acknowledgement of like body positivity, no body shaming. As a matter of fact, like shut your mouth about anything having to do with anything unless somebody asks for your opinion. And not determining your worth by your weight, like and also on our end too, we're trying to, much like Erin just said too, we're trying to also encourage, if not insist upon, healthcare providers paying really close attention of how they even approach weight discussions. Like Erin, you had that specific example of about saying how much you lost and the person kind of like brushing that off. And then we get the other side of things where someone is comfortable with their weight, whatever it is, and don't even get me started on BMI and how insignificant that should be. But the fact that they are comfortable with who they are, go in for a cold or a broken elbow, and then immediately get told that they should be losing weight. So in your case, it was dismissed, and in other person's cases, it's like, that's not what I came in here for, and why are you forcing that upon me? So Trisha, could you speak a little bit about that too? Not just the generational things, not how, for lack of a better word, insensitive, a culture might be for someone who is dealing with this particular issue of having disordered eating patterns or eating disorders being actually diagnosed, and then again treating it like, oh, what's the big deal, that's just how we are, whether it's generational or cultural or gender related too. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Well, that, I think your question is a string of questions tied together. To address the cultural thing, I think another thing is, obviously in Asia, eating disorders are not talked about nearly as much as here, even though it's still under talked about here. And people are struggling a lot with that, but there's no talk about it in the media, or you don't learn about that in school at all. But I think it's also different that, people who grew up entirely in Asian culture, it's kind of, they were kind of raised to brush these off like, oh, it's not really about you, it's about us not having something else to talk about, or it's just small talk. But when you're raised like partly in American culture, you're given this idea that if you're struggling with anything, you should talk about it and you should be taken seriously. And so you do, and you're not taken seriously, and you go like, oh wait, but that's not how it's supposed to go. And that makes it challenging for us because there's no manual for how to navigate Asian American life and how this is supposed to play out. And I think it'd be interesting if a group of third culture kids got together and wrote about like, how do you navigate things like talking to your parents and getting them to understand, like, I know this is not how you're raised, but this is important to me, but also I don't want to not acknowledge the fact that I have to be sensitive about your considerations as well. And I think that's why education about and awareness about culture is also important among medical professionals, because I think it's pretty universal, like no one likes to be fat shamed in the medical community. And when you, like you said, when you go into an appointment, like if you have a broken leg, it's not the weight's problem, it's someone bumped into you. And we are seeing that. I think medical professionals are trying harder to pay more attention to how they address something, but most doctors are just not trained in nutrition or any of this stuff. So it's rough.
That is definitely something that's coming up a lot. I mean, I think if anything, of being somewhat locked in last year gave us all a lot of time to reflect, whether it was good or bad thoughts and stuff. And so one of the things I was writing down too is like the wokeness of everyone nowadays, how we are perhaps in a more open society in this generation, like in this time of, in our era versus 40, 50, 100 and something years ago. But yet I think the things that you were both talking about that word sensitivity, right? So being sensitive to someone else's feelings, I think that definitely brought some of my own experiences up, that I used to remember my father especially, who was very adamant and domineering in the family, dynamic. He was, what I say goes type of thing, that I remember going to therapy and that 19, 20, 21 years old and being taught how to speak to somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be spoken to, of like, when you say X, I feel Y. Let's have a conversation about that. And instead of him, saying, "Well, yes, daughter, I'm completely open. What do you need to know? And I'm happy to make some changes to make you feel more comfortable." It was, "Why do you need to be so sensitive? I'm just saying things. Like, what's the big deal?" And so it felt very dismissive and like, invalidating, as you guys were saying as well. And so how do we rectify, I don't know, there's not an answer to this, but how do we rectify wanting to be, because we were probably all raised to be respectful to our superiors, to our authority figures, and be respectful of them, the obligation that we have to love within our family, but then also to be like, I gotta dissociate from this crap because it is killing me. Like, it is literally making me deteriorate in some way, whether it's mentally or physically, that I'm not being listened to. So, you can't force someone to want to change their own behaviors or be awake to open to be that, because again, they have their own issues going on. So I appreciate the fact that we kind of disclaim that in the beginning. These are all our own experiences. We're not necessarily shaming any particular culture, but holy hot dang, it would be lovely if people could just let their guard down a little bit and be open to communicating, especially with their kids, like how they don't even recognize the amount of therapy we've all been through in the past decades just to undo the damage that was done back then, if we could have come together to some sort of understanding. So again, I'm just saying words just because I'm acknowledging and validating both of your experiences and trying to understand how that also relates to my own progression through the ages. I mean, I've come to the point where I just stopped. He's since passed, but I just stopped talking to my parents for things. I just went to like other people who I thought of as parental figures, but there was a really big hole in my heart for having to let go of that relationship, because that's where I lived. Those are the people I went to see all the time. So you kind of find family, I guess, where it is, and you look for answers with people who are a little bit more sensitive to that. And in the same case too, for anyone watching this or even ourselves, you don't have to sit there and listen to a healthcare provider tell you things that don't sound right. Go find someone else, even if it's, I can't, my insurance doesn't cover it. Your insurance has a directory of people. Try to find someone who works with you or might work on a sliding scale to accommodate your budget, so that you don't have to feel so shamed and neglected in that way. So let's go back to a couple of other things here, because we did have some notes that we wanted to cover too. As far as like the lack of understanding of mental health, like let's talk about that too. It is somewhat stigmatized or taboo. So what happens there, right? How do we rectify the older generation, whatever they went through, and kind of brushing that off, and the newer generation? How would you, Erin, if you were with somebody now who was younger than you and you were acting as a role model to them, how might you make them feel more comfortable in being okay with sharing and saying, like, there are people out here who want to listen to you? Are there any resources too that maybe you found that worked for you that you want to share?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with just listening and just like not being dismissive of everything, because I'm just like thinking like a lot of my experiences with mental health struggles, namely like depression, anxiety, um a lot of the time I would reach out to people or go to my school, go to my parents, and they'd be like, "You're just making it up. Like, you're fine. You're fine." But obviously I was struggling. So I think a really big important factor is just like have listening ear, being understanding and compassionate. Like validating someone else's feelings is so important. Just like making sure they feel heard is something I think can be very helpful. And obviously, if you have the resources, connect them to whatever help they can get. I would say in Shanghai, I have been to Community Center Shanghai. That was like my first in-person therapist in Shanghai, and the person I saw was very, very helpful. That's definitely a resource you can find here. I haven't really looked anywhere else, but I definitely think it's very hard actually. Like therapy here is it's not a common thing. Like no one really talks about going to therapy. It's like there's a word in Chinese called 神经病, and people use that. Like the exact translation is you have a mental health problem. But my parents and other people have used that to call a bad name someone. Like you call someone a bad name and you say that to someone if they're being crazy. So that word is associated with being crazy. So it's just like the entire mental health, like it's very, very, like it's very untouched. People don't really understand it. I would say it's definitely more common within the younger generation to talk about it, but it's almost as if like it doesn't exist within like the older population.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's a really good point too. Like that's, I think that's the terms that we tend to use. Oh, you're bipolar, or she's acting crazy. And you're like, okay, hold on a second, because there might really be a mental health issue there. So let's not make it so like, let's not try to negate the fact that something might really be going on underneath. Perhaps they do have an issue like that. Trisha, for you too, I mean, just listening to both of your stories, it sounds like you both recognized there was an issue. Like nobody had to tap you on the shoulder and say, something's going on here. What's happening? In fact, it was almost like they were like, oh, yay, plotting that you are looking better by being thinner. So can you talk a little bit about that too, as how you became aware, much like maybe some other people might not be aware, what might be some of the factors that you would look at if you were sharing your story with somebody and maybe, trying to be sensitive to what they're going through, to gently encourage them to look within if they might be struggling with something? Or there's certain things that are somewhat similar in the disordered eating world that sound, that sound like a red flag to people for us to look out for if we want to gently encourage somebody, I think you might have an issue, without overstepping the bounds.
Yeah, I think that as we talk more about mental health issues, what we come to realize is wording is especially important. Like how you say something to someone, especially someone who's struggling, is what makes all the difference. You could discourage them from ever talking about it again, or driving them further into their behaviors, or you can nudge them to question like how they're doing without directly saying you need help. And I think that's what therapists try to do, right? They don't really tell you to do anything. They dance around it and they get you to think about it by asking you a ton of questions. And in the same vein of wording, I think one issue with mental health in China is that, kind of like how Erin said, all of the illnesses that are official names in Chinese, they have some sort of connotation to them. Like Alzheimer's is just technically someone's name, right? It's the guy who discovered it or labeled it or coined it. But in Chinese, for example, Alzheimer's would be like you're just terrible at remembering things, or anorexia would be you hate food and that's all it is, or bulimia would be you're just greedy and you want to eat a lot of food. And people don't have an option to call it something else because the words don't exist. And what I learned about wording when it comes to this from 1984, actually, the book 1984, is that if a word doesn't exist in your vocabulary, it doesn't exist as a concept in your head. So if this concept is only tied to this connotation and you don't have a neutral way to address it, then that is how your brain sees it, and that's how it functions in your vocabulary and your society. So I think a lot of these disorders have to be renamed, and this is how you get people to think about it a bit differently. And it would sound a lot less taboo for people to talk about it and maybe even reach out for help. And what I'll say to the people around someone who's struggling, who want to urge them to get help, is that you can't force someone to get help, even if they're dying and their heartbeat is 27 beats per minute. You can't force them to do anything. You have to encourage them and make sure that they know resources are there, non-judgmental resources are there if they need it, and ask them questions to nudge them into thinking about, am I actually doing okay?
Right. And I think that speaks to like, oh, I don't want to be nosy and I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But you can say, I'm just maybe concerned. Something seems to be a little bit different about you, just in case are open to it. I'm here to talk, or I'm here to give you some resources, and say it in that very gentle way. But you bring up some profound points there about the wording and the language of how things are translated or not translated to a more gentler, softer way. It's almost like it's your fault for not having control over something, and so now we're shaming you because of that. Like, I have no control over remembering things, and that's stupid of you to not be able to remember stuff. Meanwhile, you're like, no, I have like a disease in my brain, or this is just wear and tear of the body. Like, I have no control over stopping that from happening. So that's a really interesting, and like I said, a profound thing too, of how, just tying in that 1984 discussion, which back then used to be a futuristic concept, and now here we are, 30 something years past it, and it's still quite relevant in some of the concepts that it brings up. For anybody who's not read it, highly recommended, or go watch the movie. It's just as good. Trisha, is there anything else that we haven't yet touched upon on some of the things that maybe you wanted to point out, as far as whatever differences, the Americanizing of things, and how different cultures are as far as that's concerned, or anything that you wanted to maybe ask us that are on here that we didn't necessarily cover?
There are a lot of things I could talk about. But in terms of the Americanizing of things, I guess this point is more so speaking to the Asians who grew up in America who have immigrant parents but are otherwise surrounded by American people and American culture, is that when you're trying to change your diet or eat healthier, your parents think you're abandoning the culture and you want to ditch them, and that's not really the point. You have to acknowledge that people who work in healthcare can do a better job of including other cultures' foods in there, but also when you're 16 and you don't know what you're doing and you're confused and all you can find is what you can find, it's not about your parents, it's about like what you're trying to figure out. And kind of tying into making it harder for people to speak up in Asian culture, I think this whole idea of especially women have to be a certain way and have to behave a certain way, tying to what you were saying to Dina, it's, as long as we're talking about women needing to be a certain way, women needing to marry rich or get married at all, or that they don't have to make a living for themselves as long as they can lean on a man. Like, as long as that's in place, women will always feel like they're a commodity or they are someone else's and not someone, right? It's a big topic because a lot of how we think about things has to change for this whole situation to improve, but we tackle one thing at a time.
I was going to say, right, those concentric circles I always talk about. Start with just educating who's around you. God, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in there.
That's okay. Yeah, you start with, for example, renaming the diseases. It's a bunch of doctors get together and rename them. It's not that difficult, although I know it's going to take some time for people to start adopting it. I think they already changed the name for Alzheimer's, but no one uses it because it's new and people like attaching it to something they know. Yeah.
Right. You speak there about a lot of things because it also reflects on a person's individual ability to grasp concepts, be open to change themselves, right? Like, oh, I just call it the way it is that I always used to call it. I'm like, well, that's not acceptable anymore, or that's politically incorrect, or like, we know better now not to use certain terms. And so, it's easier for you just to stop saying that than it is for me to rearrange my mental health disorder to accommodate what you want to label me as. So that's not Like, don't you see the difference there? So I think also, perhaps again, for anyone who is watching this, who have, family members, people in their circles who are still kind of like a little bit obstinate about those things, talking them into is not easy, but giving examples of why it could be hurtful might tug at a different heartstring there. I mean, I remember my mom with the whole Confederate flag and all this stuff. She was like, but they're statues and it's history. I'm like, imagine you are walking down the street and every day you're passing your abuser, and he was supposed to be put in jail and he's not. Instead, he's across the street giving you the finger. So imagine that. Okay, now how would you feel about that? It's not that you're friends with that guy and you never had that experience with him because he's your buddy. It's about that he was hurting that other person across the street and she's got to watch him flipping her the bird every day. So she was like, oh, I get that. So putting it in a way that detaches them from what they think their experience is to how understanding a more global sensitivity issue, I think that's helpful. And Trisha, and also Erin too, what you were talking about, the cultural sensitivity thing, again, in the class that I teach, that's something that's very big, trying to detach from this, what we call like the Eurocentric approach of things, slapping the Mediterranean diet on everything, telling people you can't eat rice when rice is a staple food everywhere. Instead gently encouraging people, let's see what you might be missing from your diet, or let's see how physically active you're being, and maybe that's an issue, or getting you to stop smoking and maybe drinking alcohol so excessively. Let's start with those things versus stripping people away from thinking that what they do naturally by nature in traditional ways is wrong. Like, that's not okay to do that. So again, I'm not gently encouraging doctors. I'm telling you, shut up. Just shut up when it comes to food. Just be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't shame anybody. Send them off to a dietitian or a specialist that understands that specialty, right? I promise not to perform heart surgery on anyone if you don't tell people how to eat. That's my deal. So Erin, what about you? Is there anything else that we might not have gone over that you want to share? Anything else that's thoughts, messages that you want to get out there? Oh, go ahead, Trisha. Go ahead.
I did want to ask Erin if she could talk about something. We had previously talked about how, in the same vein of like Asian Americans going to school having one culture and set of expectations, and then going home and that being completely different. How has the language barrier affected you? I know that, at least for me, in school, I was encouraged to talk about everything. At home, I'm encouraged to talk about what's for dinner and how was school, and not about how I feel or anything like that. So I literally don't have the vocabulary to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really big point. I don't know how to talk about my feelings in Chinese, and my parents only speak Chinese. And so that's definitely a very big issue, I would say. Not only the culture barrier, but the language barrier is very big. I remembered, like, I would try to go to my mom basically and tell her I have an eating disorder. This is something wrong with me. But I would I use Google Translate, and I was like, what is eating disorder in Chinese? Because I really did not know how to say it, and I couldn't just go up to her and be like, hey, like, I have an eating disorder. She would just like look at me and be like, what? Like, what are you saying? So yeah, like the language barrier is huge. Like Trisha said, sorry. At school, like, I would be seeing a therapist on the side in college, of course, about my eating. I would tell her everything. Was seeing a dietitian as well, trying to get a good meal plan. And then back home, it's like completely like scrapped, like not following that anymore. Like, we're eating what's set on the table, and you have no choice basically. And when you try to talk to your parents about it, or like why I have a food scale at home, like why I brought my food scale back because I'm measuring calories, like I had no way to express like why I was doing it, because I didn't have the vocabulary for it, like you said, Trisha.
Like literal words, you're saying, like you said, you
Yeah,
had to actually put into Google Translate. There's no word for that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty funny now I think of it, because it's just like the fact that like I remember distinctly like trying to go up to my mom and be like, hey, like I lost my period, and I lost my period because I was dieting. And because I was dieting so much, I have an eating disorder now. This is the eating disorder. And I just had to write everything in Google Translate.
Well, I think that speaks volumes then, just how the older generation or just the non-American population can't literally understand what you're saying because there is no understanding of that. There is no translatable phrase or word for that. So it's almost like you have to teach them the concept of this is what that means. Do you understand the meaning of illness or mental health or whatever, however to define it? That's such an interesting thing, not just I mean conceptually, but like literal language that's used. I didn't even think of that.
And also, there are some phrases that make sense in English, and while you can translate it into another language, it sounds stupid. So when you're trying to confess that you have such horrible feelings about yourself and then it comes out sounding stupid, you're discouraged from ever talking about it again.
Right, I was going to say those are like idiomatic expressions in a way, like you mentioned before, the literal translation of Alzheimer's and certain things as far as mental health. And I'm thinking, I remember conversations with my mom about in Italy there are different dialects in different regions, and so what one person, just for an example, one person's word for mountain is someone else's word for ocean. And imagine having a conversation where you're like, you can't swim in a mountain, what are you talking about? Like, just the lack of understanding in communicating in a language that you both know but is different in dialect. And so that is a huge, also, communication factor to take into account, not just for those of you within your own population, but for those of us outside of it, to then, what if you brought your mom to a therapy session and we were trying to figure out how to make her a part of your journey? Like, that would just, that would be very confusing for everyone in the room. So it's almost like, what are the options there? Then you have to end up driving solo to your destination of healing because there's no possible way you can get that other person in the car in that metaphor that I'm using there. That's very, very interesting. Um, Trisha, is there anything else before I wanted to launch in a little bit into like the professional side of things too, when it comes to the specializing? And so before I do, is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
What was your experience like with food and the home life?
Well, home life was interesting. My mom and dad, like I said, they were immigrants. So my mom came over to America when she was very young. She was only 9, and she integrated pretty quickly into like American society, even though at home she had to still deal with very traditional old world ways. My dad, he was a teenager and he couldn't get a visa to America, so he had to go to South America first. So he worked like tilling the soil. He worked as a farmer down there. And then from that direction, he ended up coming up to North America. So by the time he actually landed in like, New Jersey, he was about 23 and my mom was about 21 or so at that point. And so she had already become like Americanized, having been here since 9 years old. And that's when they met. Like I was saying, my dad was very domineering. Like, I still understand the old world ways of being a man in the family. And so when we grew up, I mean, there were good and bad things, so I'll give credit where credit is due. My dad was the OG. He was the original gangster gardener, and we had a garden in the back, and I learned about food and cultivating things and eating a tomato fresh out of the off the vine. And he taught me how to grill food on the grill. Like, I mean, he was very handsy like that. We worked downstairs and we did like hardware things. Like, he would always be building these random things. Everything in our house was custom made. So I really enjoyed stuff like that. But because of understanding where they came from, they all escaped the war. Like, everybody went running in the middle of the night to escape the infiltration of Mussolini and the Nazis coming in from that direction as well, and taking over and blowing up the town and stuff. So they had a lot of issues to deal with, no food, etc. So they made it very, very a priority of valuing food, valuing the dollar. And so we term it now being part of the clean plate club. So you couldn't necessarily leave the table unless you were done eating. But when I reflect upon that, I'm like, well, I was 6 and you're giving me a mountain of pasta and vegetables, and I don't even like the taste of lima beans. And why am I being force fed to eat all the stuff that my tiny little stomach can't handle? And meanwhile, they're thinking, don't waste anything. There are people starving in this world. And I'm like, well, then give it to them. I don't want to eat anymore. So I definitely think that played a role just as far as waste goes, and not recognizing portion control. Like, I would just pile things on my plate and think I'd have to eat everything versus, oh, I gave myself too much and it's okay if I toss this out, unfortunately, or put it aside for leftovers for the next day. Like that was kind of unheard of. The other thing too is we were again, because we were not necessarily Americanized in that way of like bagels and, you know, different kinds of cold cuts. Like we didn't have stuff like that growing up. So when I was at my friends' houses or even in the cafeteria, I don't know if anybody's ever watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding. That was the movie version of that. She's at the table. I remember this distinctly. Like she's the character in that movie was at the cafeteria table at a very young age, 10, 11 years old. Same thing happened to me. I was given a bag of like last night's leftovers, which was, you know, Italian bread and braised escarole and like a veal cut, like a breaded veal cutlet. It was just so greasy in a bag. And my friends are eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and bologna sandwiches. And I just felt like such an outcast. So that was another thing too, that it's not my fault that I'm bringing this traditional food to an American table. And what I was going to say before about going to other people's houses where, you know, I open up the closet and like, oh, this light would come through and it's full of like Skittles and Oreos and chips and all these things that we didn't have in our house. And I was just like, ah! So constantly eating and going home with like the biggest belly ache and never telling my parents that I had just gorged at my friend's house. So that's also why they were like, why aren't you eating? I'm like, because I just ate 16 pounds of sugar at down the street. So it's just such a weird variety of things that happened. You know, there were so many good things, but also so many not so good things too. I think for me, I noticed some disordered eating patterns in myself only because of the Americanized magazine world, you know, looking at 17 and like Glamour and Cosmopolitan back in the day, if everybody was rail thin and everyone's going on diets of either slim fast supplement drinks or, you know, I just eat black coffee and a piece of toast and I'm gone for the day. And I was like, I want to be a supermodel. So that's the stuff that I thought was healthy. And it was so not. And, you know, again, if I look at also just body image stuff back then, how I used to say to myself, oh, I'm so fat and I think these things are sticking out and I'm not comfortable with the way I feel and look. And then flash forward to now, I'm like, you know, in a weird way, I'm like, I didn't know how good I had it back then because, you know, I'm so much different in body composition now that I would be berating myself if I was looking at myself back then as I am now. Like I'm much thicker. I like whatever. I'm older, so things are starting to be in different places now too. And I'm like, whatever, I don't care. I'm still alive. And yeah, so it was a combination of a lot of things. I don't remember my mom ever being on a diet or anything. She just ate what she ate and gave no thought to it. And she's also always been a tiny person anyway. So, you know, she just did her thing. We were always not a fairly active family, but we took walks after dinner because that was a very Italian thing to do as well. Like you socialize, you gather, you take walks. So I definitely had some conflict in meeting my American friends. We were also I was, as the girl of the family, I have a brother. So I was also somewhat restricted of socializing. I couldn't have boys come to the house. I couldn't have my friends drive up to the house. I couldn't sleep over my friends' homes, because my dad was, you have food here, you have a bed here. And I was like, yeah, but I'm also trying to be like a normal person who can socialize. And so I was really outcasted. I found myself doing a lot of independent, isolated things, which when I look back on it now, you know, it made me who I was. But back then I was the freak. I was the one getting bullied and picked on all the time for all of these things that possibly were related to having come from an immigrant household, like very, very much outcasted. I had friends who were also, you know, Italian, but they were Italian American. So their generations went much deeper in America's roots than mine did. So they didn't understand the greasy bags of sandwiches from last night's dinner. They didn't understand any of that stuff. So it was really weird. I mean, you know, even now, just thinking of it too, like I have one friend from back then who was quite literally born around the same time I was, whose parents were friends of my parents, but no one else in my current group, my current circle, is nobody from like elementary school, high school, college, no one, not a single person. Isn't that weird? So yeah, and I guess that could have been affiliated to some of the things growing up. Yeah, very weird. Thank you for asking that, by the way. Anything else? Any questions? I'm an open book.
Very different. Would love to hear.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
if
it
it's
was really
okay,
interesting to hear
thank
your
you.
story.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I mean, again, I can go back and shame everybody and be like, you treated me this way and that way. I will say, since my dad passed, my mom and I have been able to talk about those things. Like, she's actually listened to all of my podcasts. She watches these things that I do. She knows, if somebody asks her, what does your daughter do for a living, she knows how to explain what a registered dietitian is. Where my dad was like, you're going back to school to make salad? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, that's because that's not what that is. So she's very much more aware and open to talking about a lot of this stuff too. And she, she'll admit also, like, I didn't know back then that that was the deal. So, she's come to forgive herself, and I've come to forgive a lot of things too. And I think that that's also plays a role too, just in advancing who you are as a person, of not necessarily faulting, like, I wish they did know better. I wish I wasn't put in under some of those circumstances, but I also know I had it much better than a lot of other people, as far as abusive relationships and restriction goes. So I'm happy to have come out somewhat okay on the other end. And if I can share too, one of the things I wanted to bring up, as I mentioned to both of you before we started talking, was in the dietetics profession, excuse me, for those of you who are going through it now, like those of you who are in school, who might be venturing off into the internship, understanding the role that the dietitian plays in the healthcare field, like, we are specialists in food and nutrition, and understanding how we can help support or manage certain chronic conditions with the different kinds of food therapies we provide to people. However, we get very limited, if at all, any training in behavioral counseling, even though technically what we do is considered MNT, medical nutrition therapy. So we think of therapy as like, oh, it's, behavioral, but no, we're talking therapeutic diets, like things that can help improve your condition by providing you with a diet that is going to help support that, whether it's, certain foods and fruits and vegetables, or any kinds of foods that exacerbate or help alleviate your signs and symptoms. And so the reason why I bring this up is because, there is a difference between disordered eating behaviors, which, quite honestly, I feel like we all have something like that. Everybody's got affected some way as a kid growing up, or, we have maybe certain food preferences, or we deal with gastrointestinal problems that then cause us to be overly conscientious of what we're eating because we don't want to have like such bad tummy issues. So there's some sort of component in that as a dietitian I feel comfortable with addressing, and getting to strategize with people of understanding where some changes can be made in their food behaviors. But in no way, shape, or form do I ever feel comfortable working with somebody who has legitimately been diagnosed with an eating disorder. That is a mental health disorder from the DSM-5. Like, that's how you're diagnosed. And so I really think it's inappropriate for a lot of dietitians to take on that role if they have not gotten through some sort of specialist training. And it could be as simple as, we didn't use this word, but there is an intuitive eating workshop, and there's an intuitive eating certification course that people can go through, where you basically, ditch the diet. Like, you don't focus on any weight discussions, you do not do calorie tracking. It's all just behavioral conversations of allowing your body to naturally go back to the state it was when you were a child. Like, I know how much I should eat, I know what I like and I don't like, instead of all the things that you're kind of having to, disrobe and take the layers off of who you are as an adult now, and that experience too, or younger adults too. There's also health at every size that a lot of us are starting to learn about too. Again, dismantling the diet culture discussion, understanding that, especially in cultures, right? So in the Asian population specifically, as Trisha and Erin were saying, for Chinese culture, very, very slim, slender, lean looking body shapes are ideal. But someone in like Ghana is going to be more robust. And so whenever anybody comes to America, you're either going to think you're too skinny or too fat, no matter where you're starting off. And that is such a messed up thing to do to people. So, even though in the cultures, in the traditional sense, that may or may not have been good or bad, right? Don't be so skinny, don't be so fat, like in that case. But then you also integrate Americanizing things and how what we deem as ideal, not recognizing that one of my biggest examples that I give in class is Lizzo, right? Granted, she's had a lot of things going on recently with some of her own weight pursuits and things that she was doing, like cleansing and these like words that celebrities, influencers tend to use a lot of times. But holy hot dang with that one too, she gets on a stage at her size, right? We think automatically, oh, she must have diabetes or high cholesterol or something. She's running back and forth, playing a flute, singing, dancing. I can't even walk up 2 flights of stairs to my apartment without like having to sit down halfway through and catch my breath. So the mere fact that as a healthcare professional working with other healthcare professionals, that we just take a look at someone walking in our office and immediately diagnose them as healthy or not healthy is a true disservice. So for anyone, again, anyone out there who's looking to become either a dietitian or works in the health and wellness field, you will be having interdisciplinary conversations. Do the best you can with alleviating all of that. Like if there are true metabolic issues that you have to address, or if there are deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, that sort of thing, that's where we can play a role. But please just don't automatically judge or dismiss someone's need for validation by their body size. That is so not okay with me. So thank you for letting me at least share that part of my platform with everybody here. Are you guys ready to wrap up? Any parting words, Erin? Any final parting words that we might want to share, or next steps for people in what to take away from this conversation?
I would just say that diversity and representation definitely matters. I would say this sector is it's very white Eurocentric, and seeing people like that represent who I am basically and talking about their experiences, it makes me feel heard. It makes me feel like my experiences are valid. And I think no matter what you're going through, just know that there's always support. There's always support that you can reach out to. And if you need help in that, like obviously feel free to contact me, Dina, Trisha, any of us. We will be more than happy to talk to you and either connect you to resources or just hear about your experiences as well. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Trisha, what about you? Any final parting words?
Yes, so like Erin said, I think representation is really important, but not just people on social media talking about it, but we need to get more people of color into the field and men into the field, because I know that a lot of men think they can't talk about their eating behavioral issues because it's a women's issue. And maybe if we have more male dietitians that are trained in disordered eating, they would feel more comfortable talking to someone because they would get it and they would understand what kind of pressure men are under to be stoic and have no feelings and be tough. So I think getting more diversity into the medical field so that people have more resources and support is really important. And obviously keep reading, keep learning, and it's really important to hear from people who are from a different walk of life, come from a different country, have different upbringing, are of a different generation. And you'll learn a lot more about why people are the way they are and what makes them open or not to receiving information.
I really appreciate that. Everybody's journey is going to take as long as it needs to take for that person. So just as a side note, right, as we are wrapping up here, when this is going to be published, I will have a trigger warning on this just to make sure that we are acknowledging there's sensitive discussions coming up. I'll have some resources and links as well. And I'll also put your information on here too, as you said, Erin. So in case anybody wants to reach out to any of us directly, I'm also going to put some information about diversification in the field of dietetics, specifically inclusion. There's a lot of Facebook groups or some organizations that are now looking towards giving scholarships for people to help them have better access to the trainings and the workshops and becoming part of the internships that are somewhat competitive and not necessarily as easily accessible for certain marginalized populations. So thank you both for being on here. I really appreciated the time that we all spent with each other, and for also, for you sharing such personal and sensitive stories. So hopefully everybody's getting some good takeaways from this.